You read the title. You know what you're in for. Let's begin. Let's talk about consistency. So let me give you a demonstration. You can either use paint directly from the pot, or you can thin it on your palette. I use a wet palette for the reasons listed in hundreds of videos and blogs describing their majesty. You may think the first is better since it's more opaque, or in layman's terms, it makes the model the color that's in the pot. It must save so much time by just globbing it on. For the vast majority of regular acrylic paints meant to be used in this hobby, out of the pot is no good. Your model will look chubby and smooth. The sculptor made the model the way it was on purpose. Turning it into a blob of cheap plastic meant for children defeats the purpose of this hobby. The models should be smooth if they are smooth and sharp if they are sharp. You don't spend 10 to 100 times more money per model just to turn them back into green army men. So what kind of consistency should you be looking for? I like one where you remove the body from the paint, but it doesn't run everywhere. A paint's body is its thickness. Miniature paints are usually pretty thick, but not in terms of oil paints or heavy body acrylic paints, the ones that come out and are more like a paste, but they're still pretty thick. They're like a non-sticky maple syrup. If they come out of the pot or the bottle thin, you probably need to shake it more, since you don't want it coming out unevenly distributed. If the medium and the pigment separate, then you're not actually applying paint, you're applying some weird uneven mixture. You really need to shake it well, so putting a little bead or a metal ball bearing will help speed up that process. So to thin it down, you just add small amounts of water until the paint feels very fluid. It's like you're almost moving water around. It's like a milk consistency, as many people have described it. The thinned down paint should be pretty much the same color as the thicker version. It's just more fluid, more flowing. So let's talk about some problems that could come up because you're painting on thin coats. If you feel like it's taking too many layers, there might be specific issues that could cause this. First, the brand you're using lacks pigment density. Pigment density is very important because that's how well your paint actually can cover something. If it's extremely thin, it's more closer to water than it is to paint, and it doesn't work as well. And that's why craft paints are not ideal for the hobby, since to work on this scale, you need higher quality pigments, which is why you have more expensive hobby-specific paints. I personally find Vallejo and Scale 75 have a lot of really strong opaque colors with very good density. Brands like P3 and Citadel, they're very thick in consistency and they feel like they should coat very well, but as you can see in this example, when I paint the magenta on in a thinner consistency, it seems to really not do a good job at all. So I don't want to force you to buy any specific brand. That'll probably be covered in a later video on what brand you should get. But in essence, find something that works with your paint style and doesn't seem to work against you. Another problem is that the color underneath is too strong. So black is a very popular color to prime in, but I really don't like it because my preferred method of painting is using thin colors and allowing a lighter base coat to help me highlight it, and I kind of shade it on my own. And so gray and white are just as accessible as black, and it really doesn't matter which base coat you use. If it works the same, then it works the same. But black is a very strong color, and so if you're struggling to, make it look anything other than black or some off black, then maybe you should prime over with some gray or white, just so it's easier to, you know, let the color make itself known essentially. Black can also be used underneath gray and white to give you easy shadows, because when you paint it, you'll have paint that's much closer to black in those recesses, and then the grays and whites on the more exposed areas, those will be much closer to the original color that came out of the pot. But in general, black as a main color is not my favorite. Another issue is that the color you're using is weak. Certain colors like yellow, white, and red are often very troublesome. Due to the nature of the pigment, it just feels like they lack the strength to cover anything, even pure white. And so painting in an intermediate shade like a gray and then the white, like a lighter brown and then the yellow, a slightly darker red and then the red you want to use, that could help give it some opacity. And through the natural highlighting and shading, it makes sense you'll have a darker color underneath anyway, so that could help you bring the main color you want to the maximum strength. You could also be thinning too much. So some techniques will call for extremely thin paints to very slightly tint the colors underneath. Your objective at this point is to create a strong color, so making a very weak paint is just not going to help you at all. If you do add too much water to your paint and it's just a wet mess of underpowered pigment, all you have to do is just add more of that thicker paint to it until it gives you that consistency you're looking for, flowing but still strong enough to cover. These are just a few problems that could come up from base coating. If you feel like you know something that I've missed, then please feel free to comment it, and don't be afraid to ask questions if you're having trouble with something specific. Now that I've gone over at least a few things that can go wrong, why is painting thin so great? So as I mentioned before, you can retain the shape of the model instead of reducing it to a blobby mess. You have an easier time cleaning mistakes since there's less paint to remove when it's wet. You can just take a brush that's just slightly moist, doesn't have any paint on it, and that'll usually wipe wet paint away very well. Or you could use like a cloth or little piece of tissue paper or something. And if you use very thick paint and you put it in the wrong area, then you're just going to have some kind of gloop that will be very hard to remove. It would take a lot more absorption, and it's really just a big headache if it's just an excessive amount of paint. If the paint is dry, again, sanding or painting over is much easier if the paint is thin, because there's much less weight behind it, so it won't take as much to kind of undo that mistake. If it's so thick that it's very hard to actually make the that area perfectly even in color, or if it actually leaves a physical mark because of how thick it is, it created its own texture, then you kind of done something wrong. So thin paints, they will pull away from the edges and slightly collect in the recesses. And if you're using a white or a gray undercoat, something that's lighter than the paint, then this actually works to your advantage since it helps you along with that initial highlighting and shading. It's a similar effect to Citadel contrast paints, but without the price tag. At the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, do you want to spend less time, get more frustrated, and end with uglier models? Or spend a little more time and get a far better result? You don't have to have any special techniques or knowledge to create a strong foundation for that individual model and for your lifelong journey in this hobby.